Thank you, Donald. Well, all eyes on America, because as we speak, Mark Zuckerberg, the boss of Facebook, is there before a US Congress committee, and he's kind of been getting his apologies in early. He said, I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. It was my mistake, and I'm sorry. Well, however this meeting goes, before the committee today, and he could be back again tomorrow, all of you that use social media will be interested. But the even bigger story is, of course, the Commander-in-Chief, Donald J. Trump himself. This was Trump last night talking about the chemical weapons attack in Syria.
Make a decision on all of that, in particular Syria. We'll be making that decision very quickly. Everybody's going to pay a price. He will, everybody will.
Mr. President, U.S. military action, is it off the table as it relates
Nothing's off the table. Nothing's off the table.
Is there some doubt?
Well, that was Trump in very, very bullish mood. And remember that in April last year, Trump did launch a cruise missile attack against the Syrian airbase after a previous chemical weapons attack. So he's done it before, and it does sound very much like he is going to do something again. He was backed up very strongly by the US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who said the world must see justice done. So it looks like the Americans are on the verge of taking action as a punishment to Assad for this chemical weapons attack, which, whilst Assad denies it, America and others in the international community seem to be convinced that it's them that did it. What has the response been from the United Kingdom? Well, a man who features almost every day now in our news and on our programme is former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Here he was this morning.
We're not talking about ground action here. This would be action in support of military intervention by the US, and on the assumption that the evidence that our military and our services have is the same as that of the US, then I think if you don't respond to this, to the use of chemical weapons against civilians, then obviously, you know, we're ignoring what the international community has said, which is that this is unacceptable and those that use such methods should be held to account, and we're giving carte blanche for future use of chemical weapons. So, you know, I think it's a pretty simple equation. I don't think it solves, however, even if we take the action, which I think we will have to do, it doesn't solve the longer term question of what happens in Syria.
Well, Tony Blair never short of an opinion, and also, of course, the man very keen on military action at all times. And breaking news, we hear that Donald Trump has cancelled his trip to South America. He is staying in Washington, D.C. to oversee, I'm guessing, America's response, which could come very, very soon. So Tony Blair telling us, we've got to. We will have to quote him. Interestingly, William Hague, writing in the Daily Telegraph today, said, the world has succeeded for nearly a century in preventing the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. Once we accept that this is just another aspect of war, that is what it will become in future conflicts for the coming decades. So Hague says, act or chemical weapons become a fact of life in wars that are fought right across the world. So we've got the British establishment lining up, keen for military action. What do I have to say on this? This is the same military establishment who lined up and formed a pretty big consensus over Iraq. It was about regime change. It wasn't really ever about weapons of mass destruction, and I bet Blair regrets having ever made that argument. But it was about regime change, and sure enough, we toppled Saddam Hussein. And then we go fast forward a few years to Libya, where virtually nobody in the House of Commons stood up and thought it was a bad idea to attack Libya. I have to say, I thought it was one of the worst foreign policy decisions we've ever taken, and I wasn't shy in saying so at the time. Undoubtedly, we have made Libya a far worse place than it was under Gaddafi, and Iraq. I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of people have died in Iraq, and there's still no real proper settlement in sight. You know, we intervene. We get rid of these Arab nationalist dictators because we think it's the right thing to do, having never thought through what the long-term consequences are. Look, I don't know whether Assad used these chemical weapons or not. I don't know why he would, given that he's winning the war anyway. But maybe it was him. But even if we knew it was him, and we decided, right, we are going to attack military bases, attack the palace, If the result of concerted action with us, the Americans and the French, results in the overthrow of Assad, is that the right thing for us to do? Well, we may think morally it is the right thing to do because of some of the horrible, awful things that he's done. But ask yourselves a question. What comes next? Chaos, instability, and who's to say, maybe a chance for ISIS to build their forces again. So I would say, even if tomorrow Trump attacks, not waiting for a UN resolution, he didn't last year, after all, I don't think we should join. And even if we got a UN resolution, I would still be very, very thoughtful about this. What, in the longer term, are we actually trying to achieve? That is my view. I want to know what your view is. If Trump intervenes in Syria, should Britain follow suit? And if you think yes, those pictures are so awful that we have to do something, call 0345 60 60 973. Maybe you think we need to wait at least for a mandate from the United Nations, in which case text to 84850, or maybe like me, you think intervening in the past has actually made things worse and not better, in which case tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. Watch us on Facebook. I'm live from here in Brussels. Next, Hal is my first caller from Bangor. Good evening, Hal.
Hi, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. So it looks to me, Hal, like Trump is within hours of doing something. I don't know what the scale of it will be, but it kind of feels bigger than the limited airstrikes that he took last year. Should we follow?
To be honest with you, Nigel, I'm holding back the tears at this point because when you say larger, you're right. I foresee this as a World War III type situation. I'm not going to make many bones about that.
Yeah, because actually, if we do hit Syria in a big way, aren't we in some way provoking a conflict with Russia?
Yes, and I'm reading that China is suiting up as well. Trump wants to pop at them as well. We know this with the trade wars, etc. This is going to mushroom, and I think mushroom is the operative word, to be macabre about it, but, mushroom clouds, etc., could be the worst possible outcome.
Yeah.
And basically, I've disagreed with you vehemently in the past, Nigel. Whatever your role is in all this, I don't know, but whatever. I'm prepared to put that aside, just to talk to your listeners and say, this is going to be huge, and there's not much we can really do about it, because, we marched like buggery last time against Iraq, and no one listened. So whatever we try and do, it's not going to work. The Tories want the war. They want to prop up Theresa May. Labour moderates want to pop up Corbyn, so they'll support a strike. And whoever else you gather around, it's going to lead to a vote in Parliament. It's going to lead to a strike. We're part of this now. So all I'm saying is if you're in a community and you're worried about this, come together and talk about it, because you're going to probably be sending off family members to fight, quite possibly. And this is going to be enormous impact on your community. So come together now to talk about it.
Can I ask you, Hal, are you opposed to all war at all times?
I'm not. I think something needs to be done about something. I'm calling from Wales. We have an expression in Wales, sorry the chwys, break your sweat. Something has been building for decades now, and I think this just needs to be done, whatever it is. Get all the fighting done, get all this macho bullshit out the way, so we can build a better world.
Mind the language, Hal. Mind the language. Mind the language. But I can tell you, I can tell you're very emotional about it. Hal, you genuinely think this could spark off into something really quite big?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Hal, I thank you very much for your call and passion and indeed emotion. Hal, they're really, really worried. And I guess, if we do take on, or if Trump takes on some of these targets in Syria, there is a chance, is there not, of Russian collateral damage? Because after all, they are working together over there. Phil on Facebook says, absolutely not. We shouldn't get involved with no evidence. Troy says, intervention in Syria would be a profound mistake. And Barry says, we intervened in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and now, years later, it's worse than it ever was. Barry, I struggle to disagree with that. I really, really do. And I remember in 2013, Haig and Cameron were absolutely hell-bent on intervention in Syria. We were going, if you remember, to arm the rebels. And for once, Parliament listened to public opinion. People were scared of losing their seats because of the way the public felt, and they got voted down. Quite how Haig wasn't forced to resign as Foreign Secretary, I have no idea. And I now think, thank goodness, because had we armed the rebels, we hadn't got a clue who they are. We may well have found ourselves giving arms and money to ISIS, and that would have been crazy. Laura lives in Finchley. She's a new caller to the show. Good evening, Laura.
I'm not a new caller to the show, just the first time that I've ever spoken to you, Nigel, and possibly
Okay.
This is the first time I've ever agreed with you on anything. So
All right.
I'm wondering just how the government's going to sell this war to us, because how can you actually, okay, if children are gasping for breath because people have somehow contaminated them with nerve agent, how is bombing them going to improve their situation? Because we can't bomb Assad. It's impossible to get him out of the way, so we can bomb civilians, which is not going to make anything better. The other thing is, obviously, this has all coincided or been lined up to coincide with John Bolton taking up his new role yesterday, and I've been terrified of that, because wherever John Bolton goes, there's a trail of death and destruction following him. So this is all part of, I would say, a plan laid out that which leads to Iran, and Syria is just one of the steps.
Well, it may lead, Laura, it may lead to Russia as well.
I don't think we'd go there. I think it's the idea of a conflict with Russia that's kept us largely out of Syria for the last 8 years.
So,
the other thing I want to say, I know that we're always talking on the radio about homeless veterans with PTSD, and, traumatized people. So, do we really want to send more of our sons and daughters to die in battles which are of no benefit to this country?
What?
Syria is not a threat to this country. The only country who benefits from having continuous instability in the Middle East is the State of Israel.
Right, Laura, thank you. You made your views very, very clear, very strong. Let me know what you think. If Trump intervenes in Syria, should we be there too? When you hear Donald Trump talking about that chemical weapons attack and those young children being killed and suffering badly, you're left in no doubt he is going to act. It seems pretty clear to me. He did last April in similar circumstances. I just feel that the tone that he's using, it's a much higher level of rhetoric than was there last year. We know he's been on the phone several times to President Macron of France. We know he's been on the phone at least once to Theresa May in the UK. And I'm asking you, if Trump intervenes in Syria, should Britain follow suit? Sian says no, the government have other priorities at present, like getting the best possible outcome from Brexit. Charles says no legitimate reason to intervene in Syria. Trevor from Marylebone is on the line. Good evening, Trevor.
Good evening, Nigel.
So we've got Tony Blair telling us we have to do this. We've got William Hague telling us, Trevor, that if we don't do this, chemical warfare will become a sort of part and parcel of modern war. What do you think?
Well, I think the thing to do is whatever Blair and Hague say, do the opposite. I mean...
Right. Is your faith in our former leaders that low?
It's low, but I'm not that good at articulating.
Right, okay.
What I think's going on, and of course no one can look at the pictures, the horrible pictures, and
they're
not
awful.
Feel sick,
they're awful.
Not feel sickened and appalled. But of course, it's a question of what one does. And the thing is that hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been killed in the civil war, going back several years. What I think is happening at the moment, there's perhaps a change in the dynamic. You have the Iranian-Russian Syrian triumvirate, and the Americans have said, hang on, we've had Crimea, we've had Ukraine, it's enough is enough. And what they're doing is they are trying to find a way of keeping Russia under control. And Syria is the place where it's all happening at the moment. The intervention is going to be, depending on the level of it, of course, has the same potential disasters you have as in Iraq. And as you rightly say, it won't achieve anything. It won't result in any of the Syrian suffering being reduced in any way. The only thing is query, is this very dangerous Syrian, Iranian, Russian triumvirate in the Middle East something that needs to be addressed? And the question is, if it is, what is the right way of addressing it?
But the one thing I suppose you could say, Trevor, if there is one thing to say in Assad's favour in all of this, it is that he, with Russian help, has really smashed ISIS, hasn't he?
I'm not sufficiently aware or okay with all the facts regarding the reason for the defeat of ISIS. It may be that it's a byproduct of that alliance. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, Trevor, ISIS is not defeated everywhere, but militarily, on the battlefield, there in Syria, they pretty much have been defeated, and that's why there are 400 people, Trevor, who are UK citizens who went over there to fight for ISIS that are now back walking our streets. But, I mean, that's maybe a positive thing I can say. I'm with you, Trevor. I do worry that this sort of three-way axis that's been developed is potentially very dangerous, but I cannot see how our intervening is going to make things any better at all, and I thank you very much indeed for calling in. Peter is a new caller. He calls from Woking. Good evening, Peter.
Hello, Nigel.
So does morally, Peter, something have to be done?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, I accept the arguments and the very real dangers of us getting involved in military action in Syria. But I'd just like to ask you a question. Have you seen The Darkest Hour, the Winston Churchill film? I thought you had. And, I mean, Winston Churchill was a very lone voice when Hitler was a very real threat to the stability of Europe. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that we're in the same situation now, but if we allow this to go unpunished, what will be the consequence of that?
Well, Peter, I could argue slightly differently and say you're right. Churchill was a lone voice, all of which goes to show, be very suspicious when a consensus forms in politics. Because my experience is, when everybody agrees, they're nearly always wrong. And Churchill stood out alone, warning from 1933 that Germany was the real danger, and was made a figure of fun and mockery for doing so. So that's the way that I look at it. William Hague's argument, Peter, is, the German army used gas in 1915. It was the first time gas had been used in warfare. It was chlorine gas that they first started with. We then responded using gas, and on the battlefield, that weapon was not then used in World War II. It was used a little bit in the Iran-Iraq war, going back to the 1980s. But Hague's point is that the use of gas as a military weapon, for best part of 100 years, had not been a commonplace thing. And that if we let this go unpunished, it will become commonplace. That's his argument.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with him. I mean, we are in a situation now where Russia is playing its political games all over the world, and the situation in Syria is exactly as he anticipates it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he isn't planning to down an American or a British or a French aircraft that takes part in this to up the stakes again. And I think that's what you want to avoid. And I understand your position on this.
Yes.
But what happens if we do nothing?
Well,
what we're doing is we're then accepting that the use of gas on civilian populations is acceptable. There comes a point
can condemn it, Peter.
Got to stand up as a world and say no.
Well, and maybe that's what's going to happen, Peter, but fine, we can stand up for moral principle and say this is wrong. We can say we've now got the proof that it's him that did it. It's morally wrong, and we can act. But I tell you what, Peter, if we bring about the overthrow of Assad, those very distressing pictures that we've seen could be repeated on many, many multiples in terms of scale. That's my fear. That's my feeling. But Peter, I understand your passion on this and the feeling that we can't just let him get away with it. Very much what Blair said this morning. You know, Blair did say actions have consequences, but not acting can have consequences too. There we are. I've been even-handed about Tony Blair. Can't be bad. Tony says to me, as a veteran, please don't get involved, as we don't have the manpower now due to this government's cuts. Amy says, it is not our job to punish anybody to the point it requires we act immorally, and in defence of motives we are not privy to. Amy, who's to say? Nikki is calling from Ongo. Good evening, Nikki. Hello. Right, couldn't get Nikki. I'll go to Ali in Hounslow. Ali, good evening. Hello.
Hi there, Nigel. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing okay. So, you know, Trump is going to act, isn't he, Ali? It looks pretty clear to me that Trump is going to act. What do you think we should do?
Britain, as well as France, should not interfere, and they should not get themselves involved in Syria. Now, we know the debacle that they spearheaded in Libya in 2011, in which they destroyed the progressive nation in Libya, and which led to Islamist terrorism, uncontrolled flow of illegal migration into Libya, and destabilize across the Sahel region, not just Libya, but across the Sahel.
Well, actually, Ali, all those big numbers coming across the Mediterranean by boat, going to Italy and Greece, guess where they were coming from? They were coming from a destabilized Libya. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And this is what it's so annoying. What Bashar al-Assad, he might not be the best in Middle East, but the good thing is that he's maintaining some form of secularism in Syria, and he does have popular support amongst the Alawites, Christians, Shiites, and as well as some Sunnis and Kurds. Progress has been done in Syria. He still has some form of legitimacy, and he does control half of the nation. Now, if America intervenes, and like what you said, if they do topple him, who knows? Yeah. ISIS will recruit. We need to understand, a few months ago in Raqqa, America allowed 3,000 armed ISIS Islamist militia to escape Raqqa unharmed and untouched. Where are they now? Are they recruited in the desert of Syria?
Ali, the worst thing we could do is to leave a vacuum for ISIS, particularly after Assad. He's done one good thing, has militarily beat them, at least in that country. Ali, I thank you very much. Mark Zuckerberg has just walked into the joint hearing of the US Congress. More on that in a moment, but for now, you're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. So Mark Zuckerberg is now giving testimony in Washington, D.C. before a joint committee of the US Congress, and we will keep you up to date on this show and those that follow to find out what he says and just how tough the questions are. Before we get back to the question of if and when Trump intervenes, should we follow, a couple of other news in briefs. The Scottish National Party has decided that the concept of British values can cause offence and could play into the hands of groups who seek to assert that there is an inherent conflict between being British and being Muslim. So we're not going to teach British values in Scottish schools. That is political correctness gone completely loopy and crazy. Piece of real common sense today. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have not invited Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn or other politicians to their wedding. I reckon they've just about got that right. A bit of breaking news from Brussels, which you'll hear a lot more about over the course of the next weeks and months, is Michel Barnier, you know, that friendly fella who's doing the negotiations with us. He wants Britain to sign a non-regression clause, which would mean that even after we've left, we would have to keep our legislation, whether it's on the environment or employment or whatever it may be, absolutely the same as the rest of the European Union, something I think that's going to cause Mrs. May big problems over the course of the next few months. And Yulia Skripal has been discharged from Salisbury Hospital 5 weeks after she and her father Sergei were found slumped on that bench in central Salisbury, obviously making really good progress. She's been spirited away to a safe house, but Russia has responded by saying that any secret resettlement of the spy or his daughter will be seen as abduction. They do have a strange way of operating on the international stage. Back to this question. Back to if and when, as and when, I think, really, Trump intervenes, should we follow, with or without a UN resolution? I'm going to ask Nikki in Ongar that very question. Good evening, Nikki.
Good evening, Nigel.
So how do you feel on this one?
Oh, I feel really, really strongly. I can't believe that we might follow Trump on this. It just seems a disastrous idea. The trouble is that Trump's come in order to get Mueller off his back, ostensibly against Russia, and May's gone in thinking it'll make her look strong, and it's her Falkland moment so that she's trying to be Thatcher. I mean, it's a complete disaster. We can't go to war on that basis.
Well, it could be, Nikki, that it's not actually going to war completely. It could be that these are limited strikes, as indeed Trump conducted last year, that are designed to be a warning and a message: don't use these kind of weapons.
I do think we're playing with fire, though, if we do that. I mean, with Russia supporting Syria now much stronger than it did in the days, when that last strike was done, I think Russia might well be tempted to come to Syria's aid.
That would be pretty scary stuff, Nikki, wouldn't it?
It would be extremely scary. And I think, what they want is regime change. They want Assad to go. And it just seems it's all wrong. There's no way Assad should go. The problem Assad has is ISIS. And we should have supported him against ISIS. But instead we supported rebels that were pro-ISIS. I mean, it just makes nonsense. The reason we don't like Assad is because he wouldn't let a pipeline cross his country and to give gas into Europe. It's all political. There's no good reason for going in. There really is not. Assad is a civilized, educated man.
Well, he is civilised and educated, but that doesn't mean he hasn't done some bad things, Nikki, does it?
No, I'm not saying that he hasn't, but we don't actually know whether it was Assad who ordered it. I mean, it could well have been ISIS. Chlorine gas can be obtained quite easily. It could easily be the rebels themselves who are just trying to frame Assad, because they want to topple Assad.
And yet, Nikki, the international community seems so certain about this, don't they?
It's because it suits everybody's agenda. That's the trouble. The Europeans want Ukraine. Trump wants Mueller off his back. And May, she wants to look big and brave. It's a disaster.
So you are a don't intervene in any circumstances person,
Don't intervene in any circumstances whatsoever. I would be very surprised if that gas was from Assad. It just isn't in his interest to do it. Why would he? He's nearly won.
Yes, Nikki, that is the very, very powerful point, isn't it? He's nearly won.
He's so nearly defeated ISIS. It would be madness for him to bring chemical weapons into. I mean, he wouldn't do it. He's very popular. That's what you never hear in the press in this country. The civilized people in Syria love him. He's a very popular man. It's only the rebels who don't like him.
Nikki, you made some very, very, very good points indeed. Thank you. Dale says, maybe if the UK and the USA just leave Russia to get on with sorting out terrorists in Syria. Well, they were doing that, Dale, quite effectively until this chemical weapons attack. Wayne says, let them sort their own affairs out. Why do we feel we have a right to police the world? Leave well alone and keep out, says Wayne. Adam is calling from Battersea, a new caller to this show. Good evening, Adam.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you doing?
I am doing well, but I sort of certain sense of deja vu, Adam. It's all the same people lining up saying that we should have intervened back in 2013. We should have armed the rebels. If we had done that, we wouldn't be in this situation. And frankly, I just don't believe them, Adam.
I completely understand where you're coming from, but I just think that for these acts that are going on to go unpunished, and for us as democratic, wealthy countries who have very capable militaries to sit back and do nothing is a disgrace, and it's a complete disgrace to general humanity. How we can allow someone to treat their citizens so horrendously. You know, the use of gas and these chemical weapons was banned for a reason. You know, they're not really the most effective way to kill. They are there cause pain and grief, and it's a horrific way to die. It would be much more, if I had the option of gas or a bullet, I know which one I'd be choosing.
Oh, Adam, I'm sure that's absolutely right. Great distress and, of course, huge fear in all the surrounding towns and cities as well. I'm certain of that. But, Adam, you think morally we have to act. So what do you think we should do? Should we fire a few rockets? Should we invade? I mean, how far do we take this, Adam, in terms of our response?
I think that we should go as far as to basically knock out remotely his military bases, his secure compounds. I don't think boots on the ground is necessary, because I think full-scale invasion like Afghanistan and Iraq will probably bite us in the behind in the future. But I think if we can knock out his capabilities now remotely, not really risk British lives with boots on the ground, I think if we could do what Trump did earlier on this year, I think that was very effective when he started his presidency and that chemical attack happened, and he could remotely fire Tomahawk cruise missiles, but really knock out...
But was it effective? Was it effective? If it's, he did that strike with, as you say, cruise missiles, and if now it's happened again, it wasn't very effective, really, was it?
Well, no. I'd say for more of it to be used. I think only one airbase was struck when Trump when Trump did go ahead and attack. I think that we should pretty much wipe some of these air bases out. I think that we should completely destroy his air force.
Okay. Well, do you know what? That may very well happen. It looked to me like Trump was pretty determined. Thank you very much indeed for your call. And poor old Mark Zuckerberg, I say poor old, he's not very poor at all, is he really? But he's sitting there and he's taking stick already. Republican Senator for South Dakota, John Thunes, has said to him, in many ways, the story that you created represents an American dream, but you have the obligation to make sure that dream doesn't become a privacy nightmare. And this, of course, against the background that 87 million people on Facebook have had their data misused. Let's go to John in Isleworth, another new caller to the show. John, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Thanks very much for having me. What I want to do is I want to look at it actually from Assad's point of view. And, whatever you think of his morality or whatever, he's a clever guy, and he's got clever advisors around him. Now, let's say they launch a gas strike. How many people is he really going to kill? How many of the rebels is he really going to, disable?
Not 30 or 40 or 50 or... appalling human tragedy for those directly affected, but in sheer numerical terms, pretty tiny, yes.
Not many. Now, let's look at... what's been happening before. He knows that Donald Trump has said he has a big ego. He doesn't want people to think he's weak. He's already launched an attack against them after the first chemical weapons attack. So they know if they do anything with chemical weapons, he has to respond. They're going to lose way more in bases, in lives, than anything they could have took out with the rebels by doing a chemical attack. So that leaves it in my mind thinking, who rationally would do an attack like that? So I don't think that he did it at all. I think that it's very easy to sneak gas inside and fire it, into any position inside from a Syrian, government territory. And think about then why does someone have a motive to do this? Who doesn't like Syria and by extension Iran and Russia?
Yeah.
Well, you've got Saudi Arabia on one side and you have Israel on the other. To me,
so John, really, there was no motive for Assad to do this, was there?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
No. Okay. John.
This is the.
I thank you for the call. I've got to move on. Time runs away from us as ever. I get on Twitter, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But if we don't, we will be Billy No Mates post-Brexit. I'm sorry, but Brexit is not an excuse for getting involved in yet another foreign war. And to breaking news from Beijing. President Xi Jinping has promised today to cut China's car tariffs and to improve intellectual property protection in possible concessions aimed at diffusing a worsening dispute with Washington over trade and technology, and that had worried the stock markets and global investors. So you see, Trump gets tough with China. He does it because they've stolen intellectual property. He does it because, frankly, they've not behaved under World Trade Organization rules. Everybody says, what's he doing? Look at the risks. And he is getting a concession. So I think that's actually very good news for all involved. And I mentioned the other day that I've been touring around America last week, and you can catch up the latest edition of my podcast, Farage Against the Machine. I go from Colorado to Washington, up to Pennsylvania. I interview Candace Owens, who's part of the Turning Point student movement, a sort of conservative revolt, I guess, against what they see as left-wing professors. And actually, at the end, I finish up with a protest against me in America, not by the students, but by the professors who thought I simply shouldn't be there. So please go to lbc.co.uk, and that'll tell you whether you've got Apple or an Android device, how you can download the podcast, and you can comment there too. I get all sorts of comments. My hero, thank you for what you do. And then I get things like, you've done tremendous harm to our country. So if you want to make some comments there, you can, and have a bit of fun with it as well. Back to when Trump intervenes. I'm now convinced it is when Trump intervenes, should we follow? And I am really worried about the bad track record we've got. We finish up going in with a purpose of regime change, and we leave things worse than they were before. I don't yet know the extent to which Trump is going to intervene, but boy, he looked pretty serious on this. Andrew is calling from Winsford in Cheshire. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. I say well done for intervening Trump on this issue, because I don't agree with, I mean, as you said, going to the extent of regime change, but I'm surprised and disappointed at most people's attitude that I've called up this evening as regards this, because I think at the very least you have to, I mean, as regards the last person's call as well, be sure you know that it was the regime that did it, but then you basically make it not worth the while of actually doing such a chemical attack. If you're going to have rules, there's no point in just sitting back and dusting your hands and going, well, just keep gassing them, you know, because we can't get there, and because Russia have got their fingers in the pie. I mean, this attitude that Russia isn't quite the power it was. I mean, obviously, you know, they're prepared to throw the weight around, but Russia and China together aren't on even a patch on the USA together on the amount of, and Russia know that themselves. They're not.
Yes, but Andrew, you say that, but you wouldn't want to see it tested, would you?
Well, but you look at Turkey. You look at Turkey when they flew the plane over there twice. What do? We escort the planes out every time they put a plane into our airspace so they can test us out. What did Turkey do? We warned you once. They just shot it down. And so, Andrew, there's no more Russian planes in Turkey's airspace now, is there?
If I know that.
Stand up for themselves.
If these strikes, Andrew, these strikes are designed to punish and to warn and not to bring about regime change, then I think you would find more callers and texters and tweeters and Facebookers into this programme would be supportive. I'll tell you why they're taking the attitude they are, Andrew, that disappoints you. They've been lied to more than once about this stuff, and they don't like it, and they don't really trust our leaders when it comes to issues of getting involved in military action.
Come on, I don't think that you think that Theresa May is going to do that after the fiasco of the last one, where he just decided to choose to miss out quite important bits of information as regards the Iraq war.
Just a bit.
Yeah,
although Theresa May's record, Andrew, Theresa May's record is she supported the Iraq war and she supported the craziness that took place in Libya. Now, I'm quite sure.
She was given fiddly information, the same as everybody else, wasn't it?
Well, maybe she should. Well, maybe, Andrew, before you go to war, you should be very healthily sceptical about whether you're doing the right thing, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well.
Yeah, I don't think her or Parliament would push it through anyway. I mean, there's no way it's going to get to that sort of stage. I mean, but at the very least, you've got to go in and do more damage than, as long as you're sure, as long as you're 100%
As long as you're sure. Yeah, okay.
Do more damage than it's worth.
Fine. Okay. Andrew, I thank you. Let's just cross over and listen to Mark Zuckerberg speaking on Capitol Hill.
Just recently, we've seen the Me Too movement and the March for Our Lives organized, at least in part, on Facebook. After Hurricane Harvey, people came together to raise more than $20 million for relief. And more than 70 million small businesses use Facebook to create jobs and grow. But it's clear now that we didn't do enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm as well. And that goes for fake news, for foreign interference in elections and hate speech, as well as developers and data privacy. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here. So now, we have to go through all of our relationship with people and make sure that we're taking a broad enough view of our responsibility. It's not enough to just connect people. We have to make sure that those connections are positive. It's not enough to just give people a voice. We need to make sure that people aren't using it to harm other people or to spread misinformation. And it's not enough to just give people control over their information. We need to make sure that the developers they share it with protect their information too. Across the board, we have a responsibility to not just build tools, but to make sure that they're used for good. It will take some time to work through all the changes we need to make across the company, but I'm committed to getting this right. This includes the basic responsibility of protecting people's information, which we failed to do with Cambridge Analytica. So here are a few things that we are doing to address this and to prevent it from happening again. First, we're getting to the bottom of exactly what Cambridge Analytica did and telling everyone affected. What we know now is that Cambridge Analytica improperly accessed some information about millions of Facebook members by buying it from an app developer. That information, this was information that people generally share publicly on their Facebook pages, like names and their profile picture and the pages they follow. When we first contacted...
Well, Mark Zuckerberg there talking about the case of Cambridge Analytica, but hey, wasn't just Cambridge Analytica doing it, loads of people were doing it. And he can claim the high moral ground, we've raised money for charity, we're lovely and we're great people, but we perhaps should have thought about things a bit more. And I think there are actually, I know, there are huge numbers of people across the world pretty blooming angry about how much of their information has been for sale out there through their links with Facebook. It is a massive story. It's one that's being debated here in Brussels as well. And it's one that Clive Bull will pick up after the 8 o'clock news. I've got time for one last caller on this subject. Dave in Heathrow, a new caller to the show. Good evening, Dave.
Evening, Nigel. Are you well?
I'm well, but I'm watching this same old argument play out again where the politicians say we should intervene and the people, well, they vary, but I sense there's more scepticism amongst the public than there is amongst our political leaders, Dave.
Well, aren't we all watching the same show play over and over? Let Rome burn, as they say. But my point was, having lost countless very close friends in faraway conflicts that had nothing to do with us, this is yet another masquerade of power. And as much as I'm against Bashar al-Assad being allowed to kill innocent civilians, unfortunately, this is not our war, and we should not intervene. If your friend and someone I support, Mr. Trump, deems that it is in his power to do it, crack on. However,
we don't join him. We don't join him. Dave, you've got the message over. You've got the message over very, very clearly. And yet another call with a lot of emotion there too. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show.